The X Zone radio and TV show is largely an opinion talk show. All opinions, comments, or statements of fact expressed by Rob McConnell's guests are strictly their own and are not to be construed as those of the X Zone radio and TV show or in any manner endorsed by Rob McConnell, Relmar McConnell Media Company, Talkstar Radio Network, its affiliated stations, or employees.
All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
Welcome to the X Zone, everyone. My name is Rob McConnell, and for the next 4 hours, I'm your host and your guide as together we cross the time-space continuum to this place that I call the X Zone. It's a place where people dare to believe and dare to be heard. It's a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. And the X Zone comes to you Monday through Friday from 10 p.m. Eastern until 2 a.m. Eastern. And then the show is repeated in its entirety from 2 until 6 a.m. Eastern. Right here on the Talkstar Radio Network, the X Zone Broadcast Network, and our affiliates right across Canada, the United States, Central America, the Caribbean, South America, the Pacific Rim, Australia, Asia, India, Africa, and Europe. If you'd like to give us a call, our toll-free worldwide number is 1-800-610-7035. That is worldwide at 1-800-610-7035. My email address, xzone@xzoneradiotv.com. On MSN Messenger, you can always chat with us here in our studios in Hamilton, Ontario, by typing in the MSN address, xzoneradiotv@hotmail.com, and our website, www.xzoneradiotv.com. It is Wednesday, March the 17th in the year 2010, and to one and all, a very happy St. Patrick's Day. I'll bet you there are more Irishmen on this planet this very day than ever before, but what the heck? On St. Patrick's Day, everybody loves to be Irish. And we've got a great show lined up for you. Our very first guest this hour is David Paul Doyle. Now, Exo Nation, it was in 1989, at the age of 21, David Paul Doyle knew the direction he had planned for his life. Now, from the 8th grade, his passion had focused on becoming a fighter pilot, an astronaut, and eventually running for the United States Senate. Having studied in Russia and worked in the American Embassy in Moscow, and with his third year at the Air Force Academy, only 2 weeks away, his life's goals were unexpectedly turned upside down by an extraordinary event. Now listen to this. While riding in a car, listening to his favorite sax musician, he was suddenly enveloped by a powerful wave of overwhelming love. It was unlike anything that he'd ever experienced, nor had he ever known existed. Out of this incredible infusion of love, a question formed in his mind. If I was an old man on my deathbed, what would I have done in my life to have had absolutely no regrets? Joining me now is David Paul Doyle. And David, Paul, welcome to the X Zone. And what was the answer to that question?
Oh, I love that introduction, Rob. That's great. Real pleasure to be here. Yeah, the answer to that question was, I just knew immediately it had nothing to do with being a fighter pilot, nothing to do with being in the Air Force. And what kind of, in my mind, I saw myself writing books that impacted people's lives all over the world. I was only 21 years old. I had absolutely no idea what those books would be about. I wasn't a writer. Wasn't even very good at English, and yet I just knew it was true. It was so powerful, so overwhelming, so clear that literally I was the most gung-ho guy you can possibly imagine while I was at the Air Force Academy. I was a class representative. I was a soaring instructor. I was on the superintendent's list.
Right.
I was Mr. Rah-Rah. But in one instant, my life changed, and I never went back to the academy from that moment on. I knew that very minute that my life was going in a new direction. It was that clear to me.
David Paul, you and I have to take our first break for this hour. Exo Nation, David Paul Doyle is our special guest. His website is whengodspoketome.com. That's www.whengodspoketome.com. And we'll be back on the other side of this 2-minute commercial break as the X Zone starts for today, St. Patrick's Day, Wednesday, March the 17th in the year 2010 here on the X Zone. And we're coming to you live and around the world. I'll throw on my little Irish brogue here. From our studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. We'll be right back, so whatever you do, don't go away. And if you're going to get a green beer, don't forget the guy behind the mic. My name's Rob McConnell, and this is the X Zone. We'll be back in 2. Don't go away.
Sun goes down on a silky day, court and moon walking through the Milky Way. Oh, you and me, baby, we could think of something to do. It's the right time of the night. The stars are winking above. It's the right time of the night, making love.
Paul David Doyle is our special guest. His website is whengodspoketome.com. And David Paul, if you could just finish this amazing story that led you to doing what you're doing today.
Yeah, well, I had no idea what I would be doing or what I would be writing about, and that moment kind of started a real spiritual journey for me, and I started reading spiritual books for the first time and meditating and just really searching. And I don't have time to tell the full story, but I had this very profound moment of opening up to this voice within me, and so did my wife, which is how we ended up getting together. And over time, we started using this resource within us for all kinds of guidance in our relationship, how to deal with my struggles at work, and how to have a child and raise that child. And for about 10 years, we just sought a lot of internal guidance from this source of wisdom. And it changed our lives so much that about 7 years ago, I quit my job at America Online and decided to write a book to teach people how to hear this inner voice.
All right.
And my wife and I have been... Go ahead.
Who is the inner voice, or where does the inner voice come from?
It doesn't matter what you call this voice within. We're all connected to this source, and that source could be cosmic consciousness, universal mind, pure beingness, essence, the Tao, God. It goes by so many different names depending upon your belief systems and your background. But it's a source that we're all connected to, and that source is the source of all creation, whether it's the universe or whatever you want to call that creation. And that source knows, has such a deep level of truth and knowingness and wisdom that we can all tap into it anytime we want. And that's really what this book is all about. It shares people's stories from all walks of life, from all backgrounds and religions. There's Christian, Buddhist, New Age, New Thought. There's agnostic and atheist stories in there, but of people connecting with this presence and having it change their lives. And that's really one of the core messages in the book, is that we're all connected to this divine wisdom within us.
But, your website is not when the source spoke to me. You say that your website is when God spoke to me.
Yeah, that's right. I do use different vocabularies depending upon my audience, because I'm really not attached to vocabularies, but my personal background is God, is a Christian, not Christian, but Christian vocabulary based.
Right.
And so I'm used to that word. I don't have any hang-ups about it, but I know it's probably one of the most charged words in the English language. Carries a lot of baggage with it.
But doesn't that go to a testament of your faith if you keep on using the word God, and if you change it from whatever deity to suit your audience? Doesn't that give you a bit of a falsification on your conviction?
It doesn't for me personally, because to me it's the experience that's what my conviction rests upon, not upon the words that I use. But at the same time, I stick with that word because it does have power for me personally.
Okay.
So.
All right. So let me ask you this question: have you ever heard the voice of God?
Absolutely.
What does it sound like?
Well, that's one of the great things about this book is that it can sound like many things. It can be a vision, a sign, a knowingness, an intuition. It could be thoughts within your mind, or it could be a loud, audible voice. And that's these stories, I chose so many diverse stories for this book because I want to show people that God communicates with us in countless different ways.
All right, so what are some of the ways that God has communicated with people and how people can hear the voice of God?
Well, there's many. In the book, I literally have, I think, like 40 different ways that God can communicate with us through these different stories. And, some of the ones I've already mentioned.
Right.
Knowingness, signs, intuition, feelings, visions, whether external or internal, audible voices, thought-based voices. So those are probably all the most common ways that people hear that voice. And really, people are hearing that voice all the time. They usually just don't recognize it. I would believe that every single person in the world has heard God's voice, but they might not call it God's voice. They might not call it that, and so therefore they don't probably think that they've heard God's voice. But I think once they read these stories and they'll go, wow, I had an experience just like that, or God, I know exactly what that person was experiencing. I think that's one of my hopes for this book, is that it shows people how they've already been hearing that voice without knowing it.
What are some of the most common misconceptions that people have about hearing God's voice?
I think one of the biggest ones that makes it hard for people to hear God's voice is they think it's going to be this big, loud voice like in the sky. And that certainly happens, and there's all those stories in the book that are like that. But when you think that that's the only way, and you think that that voice is going to somehow be separate from your own voice, then we limit ourselves, and that belief in and of itself that it's a separate voice from you is really challenging, because the truth is that we are one with God, one with this source, and by having the belief that we're separate, it all of a sudden creates a barrier within our own mind and with our own experience, and it makes it very hard to show up exactly how we think it should.
Why do most people doubt the authenticity or the authority of the messages they receive?
Good question. I think most people deep down inside don't feel worthy. They feel like they judge themselves so harshly for seemingly mistakes that they think they've made in their lifetime, and they just don't feel worthy of, quote, God speaking to them. And also, we're so good at judging ourselves in general that as soon as a message comes up that could be from God or is from God, we have a whole series of thoughts that say, that probably wasn't God's voice, or, yeah, I just made that up, or, who knows what that was. And we believe those little thoughts instead of, questioning them.
All right, so how can we know deep inside that we're actually having the experience of having God talk to us?
It says in the Bible that God is love, and I do believe that the source of all things is love. And, essentially, if there's only two voices that there really exists in the world. There's the voice of love and the voice of fear. And, when we're hearing anything that's a derivative of love, whether it's compassion, kindness, truth, forgiveness, or any of the many different flavors of love that there are, we're really hearing that from source, from God. And, if we're hearing a voice that's filled with judgment and doubt and fear, confusion, anger, sadness, that's not not the voice of God. So I think that very simply, that can be a simple litmus test for people.
All right, let me ask you this. What steps can listeners around the world take right now to hear God's voice more clearly in their lives?
In the conclusion of the book, I go through a bunch of different qualities that are present in all of these experiences. And the most important one that all of these stories have in common is that the people sought this voice out. They literally asked for it. And so I think the desire to hear this voice is the number one thing you can do. And that desire needs to be strong enough that it manifests. You are saying to yourself within or out loud, or quietly, please, guide me or direct me or help me see things differently. And having that desire is what opens the door. I think another important thing is to be open to how that message will come to you. Instead of limiting it with your beliefs, just be open to receiving it in whatever ways are possible for you in that moment.
What are the 5 most important things to avoid when trying to receive guidance or communication from God, David Paul?
Good question. I think the number one thing is to not be attached. I think I've mentioned this. Not be attached to the form that it takes. Okay. And secondly, to not see it as something necessarily separate from you or outside of you. I would say that those are the most important things that to keep in mind. Also, to believe that you are worthy and that you do hear this voice. And to not believe those subtle thoughts that come up in your mind afterwards that dismiss whatever comes to you. I would say those are the most important things.
All right. What's the difference between hearing God and hearing God's voice?
Essentially there isn't a difference. I think there's different qualities of God. So some people define God as this very universal presence or being, and that God's voice, some people call the Holy Spirit, is kind of a mediator or translator for God. And I think that you can definitely go with those definitions, but I think essentially it doesn't really matter what you label it. You're still connecting with that source within you.
It seems that in today's society, David Paul, we like to label things way too much instead of taking the event for what it truly is, whether it's listening to the voice of God or taking a walk and smelling the spring in the air or even listening to a child laugh. We always have to label everything in today's life for some unknown reason.
Yeah, I agree with you. Over all the years of my teaching, I find that vocabulary and labeling are really one of the biggest barriers to hearing God's voice, and some of our challenges in general, whether it's about ethnicity or male female stuff, or just we label stuff, and all of a sudden it becomes true for us.
David Paul Doyle is my special guest, Exo Nation. His website is www.whengodspoketome.com. That's www.whengodspoketome.com. David Paul Doyle and I will be back on the other side of this commercial break as the X Zone continues from our studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, on the Talkstar Radio Network and on the X Zone Broadcast Network. Don't go away. We'll be back right after the news.
Time of the night, making love. No use talking when the shadows fall. Night birds calling, and he said.
Hi, this is Ken Elliott. When I'm floating around the universe, I always try to tune in to Rob McConnell.
Hey ho there, Timothy Frog on Sesame Street. When I want to find out what's going on with UFOs or ghosts, I listen to the X Zone with Rob McConnell.
This is Les Corrigan from Target Internet Development. You're listening to Rob McConnell on the X Zone Radio Show.
This is John Hogue, prophecy scholar, and you're listening to Rob McConnell in the X Zone.
Welcome to the X Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
David Paul Doyle is my special guest this hour, X-Zone Nation. His website is www.whengodspoketome.com. That's www.whengodspoketome.com. David Paul's heart lies in teaching. His passion is to reach as many people as possible with the gifts of the Holy Spirit. He hopes his book of collected stories from people around the world who have experienced communication with God will inspire readers to want to learn more about hearing God's voice and to recognize the many ways they already hear His voice in their lives. And once again, his website is www.whengodspoketome.com. Tell me, David Paul, can one use God's voice to, let's say, win the lottery or make a killing on Wall Street?
You know, it's certainly possible, but I think it's pretty unlikely. And the reason I say that is because in all my years of hearing this voice and in listening to all the other people's stories over the years, you know, the purpose of this wisdom within us is not to just make us a bunch of money. You know, there's a purpose of awakening, of really coming to understand the truth within ourselves and within the world, and that, you know, that wisdom within does not just see us as these people who are desperate for money or who need certain strokes. It sees the truth about our eternal nature, and is always guiding us deeper into that. So it's just not the purpose of God's voice to help everyone win the lottery. So I think the chances are unlikely.
Now, in your opinion, what is the most single important thing someone can do to hear the voice of God?
You know, I think the most important thing is to desire it. You know, I briefly mentioned that earlier, is that desire is really the most important thing. It's what opens the door, because God can't communicate to us unless we ask for it. You know, it goes back to that free will. Mm-hmm. You know, God doesn't judge us whatever we're doing in life, and if we don't want to hear His voice within, you know, then He's not going to give it to us. And so it's really up to us to open that door through our own desire and our own intention. So I think that's really the number one thing we can do.
Based on all the people that you've spoken to around the world pertaining to them hearing God's voice, is there any special time of day? Is there any special location? Is there any special thing that people are doing when most hear the voice of God?
That's a good question. You know, there isn't. And I think that's important to acknowledge, is that it doesn't matter what we're doing. It's available to us all the time, in every circumstance. I don't care if you're, you know, in the middle of a business deal, on the phone, having sex, playing Monopoly, you know, any situation you can imagine. We're always connected. We're always joined with that presence, and it can serve us in every moment of our lives if we want to, whether we're walking in a beautiful, you know, mountain pass or in the middle of downtown New York City.
Is it necessary for someone to be a Christian in order to hear God's voice?
Absolutely not. You know, to me, in all of my years of hearing this voice, and literally the thousands of people that I've spoken to over the years, it's not our beliefs that make it possible for us to hear God's voice. We are all simply part of God. There's nothing that exists outside of God. And so because we're all joined with this source of love and truth and wisdom, you know, it's always there. And so whether you're a Buddhist, a Muslim, or agnostic, you can still hear this voice within. You just have to have the desire to do so.
All right, here's a question. Where does Jesus fit into the entire picture? If we can hear God and God can communicate with us, what about the people who believe in Christ? Can Christ also talk to us?
Absolutely. We're all joined with Source, and obviously Jesus is really people, because he was one of the first people to hear this voice so clearly within, and literally became the embodiment of the Holy Spirit or the voice of God in his lifetime. And so that truth, that consciousness that he was able to embody is still true today. Just because his body might be gone doesn't mean his awareness and his connection is any different. And so we can listen to the voice of Jesus within, or we can listen to the voice of Holy Spirit, or we can listen to the voice of God. It's all the same. It's all coming from the same place, from the same source. And so, some people will strictly want to hear the voice of Jesus, and other times you can just listen to God's voice directly yourself, and not be through the expression of Jesus as a lifetime.
Does God personalize his communication with those he speaks to, or do people get the same message all the time?
Great question. It's so personal. I think that's one of the great things about it is God speaks to us exactly where we are. So if you're a 6-year-old child, or a soccer mom of 8 kids, or a scientist, or a biologist, maybe even a Buddhist priest or a Christian priest, all of those people could ask God the same question and get very unique, personal answers in a vocabulary and a background, and with examples that really speak to each and every one of us. So there's not just these pat answers from God, because those answers, a scientist's answers isn't going to work for an 8-year-old, and the 8-year-old answers isn't probably going to be very fulfilling to maybe a soccer mom who's dealing with something totally different.
Yeah.
So they're very, very personal.
Does God ever withhold communications from people?
No. However, because God speaks to us where we are, God doesn't have an agenda for what we receive. It's up to us. So in my experience, we're given the communication in what we're able to really take in and absorb, and what we're really asking for. So, wherever our true intentions lie, that's where God's going to speak to us at. And he's not going to give us more, because we couldn't take it in, we couldn't understand it, and we wouldn't necessarily be ready for it. I kind of call that the evolution of truth. The longer you hear this voice, it will keep evolving as you evolve.
How did you solicit the stories in your book?
I essentially just put out an email to my mailing list. My website, thevoiceforlove.com, we have over 50,000 visitors a month to our site. We have a large, mailing list of like 60,000 people, and I just sent out an email and said, hey, come share your stories, and people can submit them. And it's still up there. People can still submit their stories, because we have, new books coming out as well.
Can you share a few stories with us?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. How much time do I have to tell you a story?
You've got about 7 minutes till the next break.
Okay. One of my favorite stories is right at the beginning of the book, and I love them all, but this particular one, this lady, she was in her early 20s, had a young child who was in and out of the hospital. They had no money, and one day her daughter just collapsed and stopped breathing. And she panicked and called the doctor and, called her mom. Her mom came over, but the child just was lifeless. And so she tried to do everything she could. She was crying and screaming and trying to shake her daughter, but nothing was happening. So she called the doctor, and the doctor said, go to the pharmacy right now. Here's a prescription. Because there's nothing they could do. It was like a Sunday night. So she jumps in her car, and she's driving to the pharmacy as fast as she could, and she's crying and screaming, and she's, yelling at God, why, what's going on? Please help my daughter. And this woman didn't necessarily even believe in God, but in that moment of her crying, she heard this very loud voice that says, will you give her to me? And she's like, how can you ask me that question? She screamed, and she's just like, why would you ask that of me? And she just heard again, will you give her to me? And she said, yes, I will give her back to you if I must. And she said it was the most single profound moment of her life, and that her heart was breaking. And yet at the same time, she felt relieved because the fear had gone from her. And she realized that for the first time that her daughter wasn't really her own, that, she was really God's. And I'm quoting this from the book I'm looking at. It says, as if he were right there listening to my thoughts, he said, I created her. I breathed life into her. She is mine. And then she said, I understand, I replied sobbingly. I don't want to lose her, but I will give her back to you. And then in this voice, I didn't tell this, but it was this huge, loud voice that was filling her whole car. She said, well, and then she heard the voice say, well done, my good and faithful servant. So she gets to the pharmacy. It's closed. She comes back thinking her daughter she was gone. And she came back into the house about 20 minutes later, and her daughter just bolted to the door, and she was totally happy. And the mom said, I don't know what happened. She was just laying there, not breathing or anything. And she just popped up one moment and said, I'm thirsty, and got up as if nothing was wrong.
I have to ask you a question at this point.
Yeah.
Why in the name of heaven would she not have called 911 instead of waiting 20 minutes to see if her daughter was alive or dead?
That's a great question, Rob. I never asked her that. I don't know. I need to ask her that. I never even had the thought of asking her that. I did leave out some pieces in the story, and I know she was working with this doctor because she had been in and out of the hospital, and I don't know, but I need to ask her because I agree. I want to know myself.
Is there another? We've got about 4 more minutes in this segment. Can you give us another story?
Yeah, one of the things, even though I said God's not here to help us all win the lottery,
mm-hmm.
There is still a very practical element about hearing guidance that I just want to let people know. It's not just all airy-fairy communication. I use this voice within me every day to create my to-do lists, to ask what's in the highest good to focus on in each day, and you can use it in very practical ways. And so one of the stories I'd like to share is this lady who took this course of ours. On our website, we have this course called our 30-day course for hearing God's voice, and she took it, and she started hearing the voice really clearly, and that she was really kind of down and out, destitute a little bit, and she started asking, how can I, we need our finances to improve, and so she started slowly each day getting guided about what steps to take. And she started watching the real estate ads, and there was a house being foreclosed, and there was an auction for it. And so she went to the auction, she sat in meditation, and she just kept asking the voice what to say and what to do. And it told her when to bid and when not to bid, and 20, 30 minutes later, she walked away, getting this house at a complete steal, and her and her husband fixed it up and turned it around and sold it, literally a month later for, $25,000 or $30,000 more. And she said it changed her life, and that she's been, practicing using that voice in very practical ways. And I do want people to know that we can use this source of wisdom to guide us in the ways that are in our highest good, and that's in all areas of life.
I have to ask you a question about the first story you told us with a lady who drove to the pharmacy. Why would God call one of his children his servant?
I've thought about that, and I think that in that moment in her life, she needed to serve, to let go of her small fears, her small doubts, her sense of separation, and serve something greater than herself. And I think that God speaks to us in ways that we need to hear in that moment. He might not have said the same thing to someone else, But maybe for her, since she wasn't religious, wasn't spiritual, wasn't practicing anything, that it was kind of a way to maybe inspire her to start, moving in that direction. And so for her, maybe being of service to God was an important phrase in her life to instill that desire and intention. And I don't think he would necessarily have said that to someone else who didn't need that, but that's my guess for her.
I'm still bamboozled that she didn't pick up the phone and call 911. But that's
I
just
know. I'm serious. I'm going to call her up and say, hey, explain that to me, as well, because I'm sure that won't be the first time someone asks me that question. So.
All right, stand by, David Paul. You and I have to take our final break. David Paul Doyle is our special guest, X-Zone Nation, and his website is whengodspoketome.com. That's www.whengodspoketome.com. And he is the author of God's Voice, When God Spoke to Me, the inspiring stories of ordinary people who have received divine guidance and wisdom. Once again, the website is www.whengodspoketome.com. We'll be back on the other side of this commercial break as the X-Zone continues live and around the world from our studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, on the Talkstar Radio Network and on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. We'll be back right after this break. Don't go away.
There are times when a woman has to say what's on her mind, even though she knows how much it's gonna hurt. Before I say another word, let me tell you I love you. Let me hold you close and say these words as gently as I can. There's been another man that I've needed and I've loved, but that doesn't mean I love you less. And he knows he can't possess me, and he knows he never will. There's just this empty place inside of me that only he can fill.
Welcome back, everyone. Our special guest this first hour of tonight's show is David Paul Doyle. His website is www.whengodspoketome.com. And David Paul, what is the youngest age of a person that you've spoken to who's actually heard the voice of God in their life?
Well, I'd have to say it's my daughter. I wasn't expecting that question. But yeah, I mean, when my daughter was really young, we would just, we didn't explain what God, we didn't tell her what God was. We didn't say anything. We would just say, when she was 3 and 4 years old, if she would ask us questions about not anything, but certain appropriate questions, we'd be like, well, honey, why don't you go ahead and just ask God within yourself and tell me what you hear. And she would close her eyes and ask, and she'd open them and say, okay, I got the answer. And I several times I've said to her, well, what did it sound like for you, And she said, I just hear a voice in my head, tell me the answer. It's very clear. And I think that's really true for kids. I think kids are very connected with Source, with God. And I think as we get older with all of our beliefs, all of our separating beliefs and doubts and fears, that's really what keeps us from hearing that voice so easily.
And it's funny because I would have thought that as you got older, you'd hear that voice more often. Because you have the ability to open up, you have the ability to believe, you've had a life full of experiences to point you in the right direction. So in my humble opinion, I would have thought that the answer would have been as you grow older, you hear the voice more. Huh.
Well, I think that you might be right in terms of as you get older, you may more consciously choose to hear God's voice. You may seek it out more. You may be more diligent and committed to doing so. But I do think that for most people, especially as they get, we hit our teens, right? At some point, we kind of lose our innocence. And it becomes about, fear and judgment. And those qualities start to infiltrate our minds more and more and more. And I think that really takes us out of that loving connection. And when we get older, we might get in so much pain in our lives that we finally say, okay, I'm done being in pain, and I'm going to reestablish that connection, that awareness. And so we go through a long healing process, most of us do, of letting all that garbage go so that our minds can be really open and connected once again.
David Paul, I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight here in the X Zone. Continued success, and I look forward to the next time you and I meet here in the X Zone.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure connecting with you, and I just have to say the book just launched today, and it's already at number 42 on Amazon, and number 1 in spirituality and number 1 in religion and spirituality and New Age, so I'm pretty excited.
All right, we've got to say so long now, so thank you very much for joining us once again, X Zone Nation. For more information, visit www.whengodspoketome.com. And God, here's just a little request from me to you. The next time you want to talk to somebody and their kid is very sick, remind them to call 911 first and then continue your conversation. I'll be back on the other side of this break. Don't go away.